We wanted to ask how are these interrelated? That is, the values and the habits and the mores of a region with the leadership and ethics within the global context. The relationship between the local and the global.
Mr. Emery?
Yes, so my personal experience is in working all over the world with people is that local expression of values may have its own stylistic form that may appear to be individual. But if we get to the core values of people, then no matter where you go in the world, they're similar. If you look at the core teachings of the world's great religious philosophies, then they're more similar than they are different. The individuality will come around the expression or the homage to those values, but the values themselves are similar. So I think we have to look for the similarity. We have to see that the needs we have at all levels, in all races, in all cultures, with all ethnicities, are similar. You know, we need to care for others, we need to be appreciated, we need to have a sense of what we do matters, we need to have a sense of being treated with dignity and respect, and likewise we're nurtured when we treat others that way. So if we look for the themes at the core of all people and all religious philosophies, we'll find the common components, the identical themes that can be woven into global cultures in multinational corporations.
And now for a question from the state of Coahuila in Mexico, from La Universidad Tecnológica de Coahuila en Ramos Arizpe.
Would you please comment and elaborate a little bit on how to face this massive campaign of the mass media toward pleasure, and how to create something more of an ethical commitment to a social development, a real social development, as opposed to just mere pleasure promoted by the media?
Dr. Dunn, do you want to try that one?
Well, I noticed very quickly that no one else wanted to answer that question. I think the advertising example that we saw is probably a very good first step towards shaping societal values in a different kind of way. But I think the fundamental point is a good one, and that is the free market economy is based on individual values, individual preferences, as the speaker said, the caller, individual pleasures. And somehow we need, again, to get to the point where we understand ourselves to be living in community with others. We need to come to the understanding, and we need to start this at a very young age, of training our young children to understand that their pleasure might come at the expense of someone else. And that's not morally acceptable. And so living in community, understanding ourselves to be in community with others, abandoning this notion that we're just out for our own good, needs to start again at a very young age and to be reinforced in the organizational structures and the social structures that we find in our society. It's a very difficult question. Again, the book I mentioned earlier, The Battle for Human Nature, brings forward this very fundamental question about whether we are self-interested or pleasure-seeking by nature or by nurture. And I think what we're suggesting here is that to the extent we are self-interested as a matter of nurture, we can change systems and therefore develop more of a team, a community mentality and orientation.
Thank you. Another question from Mexico, from La Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México, Toluca, en el Estado de México.
Muchas gracias. Muchas felicidades.
Greetings to you. We would like you to elaborate a little bit more on how we can drive how can we motivate the personnel in an organization for them to develop the ability, the culture of individualistic, and to promote instead of having an individualistic idea, how to promote the spirit of team working.
Mr. Emery.
Well, that's not a short answer, but I think it's covered to the extent that we say you have to change the reward systems in the organization to acknowledge and celebrate people who do that. to support and promote the people who reach out to build teams, who reach out to other people in collaborative efforts. And we have to relentlessly communicate about it, and we need leaders who collaborate with other leaders at all levels in the business. So we have to lead by example.
Thank you. And now from Caracas, in Venezuela, from la Universidad Central de Venezuela.
Aló, aló, buenos días. Ajá, la pregunta es
Our question is the following.
¿Cuáles son los otros factores
What are the factors in the environment, in the work environment, that generate stress and
no éticas?
an unethical behavior or behavior? Hello, sí?
We have the question.
Okay, Mr. Emery, go ahead.
We have to give up fear-based management techniques. You know, a lot of our models of management come from military models, and they're absolutely dysfunctional in the global business place. So where we have very strong hierarchies, very strong controls, very strong directives, then you don't see people emerge as leaders at all levels in the business, and you don't see people reaching out to collaborate, rather they wait for direction. And so it requires a major change at the level of the leadership to go from a command and control and hierarchical, often patriarchal hierarchical model, to a collaborative model where people in the workforce are honestly and authentically asked for their ideas. Deming's work probably is the best source of how to go about the actual organization of this.
Thank you. And now for our last question of this first session, again from el Distrito Federal de México, from el Instituto Politécnico Nacional de Educación Continua del DF.
Muy buenos días.
Good afternoon.
Un saludo para todos ustedes.
Greetings to all of you.
Tenemos concretamente
We have a question for you.
¿Cómo se aplican estos
How do you
conceptos
apply all these leadership
concretamente en la
concepts
ciencia
in the military environment now? Is that applicable to the military environment?
Well,
Emery, go ahead.
Well, actually it is, and I have knowledge only of the U.S. military system. In fact, one of our colleagues, partners, was formerly a trainer in the U.S. Navy SEALs, one of the original SEAL team members. And in the U.S. Navy SEALs, for example, there is tremendous emphasis on teamwork. And in fact, a huge part of the training down in this part of the world in San Diego, where the broadcast comes from, is to have people realize that as individuals, they cannot achieve what has to be achieved. They can only do that as members of a team. So it has absolute applicability in the modern military models. So perhaps if we get trickled down, it'll affect the business models as well. I think you have some thoughts on that too.
Well, I certainly agree with that perspective, and I get a number of students in our executive MBA program who are from a military background. Certainly teamwork is the model that's reinforced, and I would basically concur with everything you said and have a little more to add.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Let us begin with Module 2, in which Dr. Dunn will discuss business ethics and corporate social conscience.
It has been clearly established that values play an essential role in effective leadership, particularly in today's globalized environment. Organizational ethics emanate out of values and culture. Therefore, leadership and ethics are intimately intertwined. I would like to focus our attention on two different but related concepts: the idea of business ethics and the notion of corporate social responsibility. First, let me distinguish between these two. Business ethics is concerned with the behavior of persons within the organization, those, of course, being the employees of the corporation. And what is meant by ethics? Ethics is concerned with the way we treat one another, with the determination of right from wrong, of good from bad, of fair from unfair, and I'm afraid in many cases is used as a mechanism for determining who is to be blamed when things go wrong ethically. Whether or not employees ought to use company resources for their personal use is a question of business ethics. Corporate social responsibility is concerned with the actions of the business enterprise relative to what I will call external constituencies or stakeholders. These are the company's customers, suppliers, communities, even governments, special interest groups, and in some cases, competitors. Whether or not companies ought to produce products which cause harm to customers, such as cigarettes, is a question of corporate social responsibility. Before going further, there's an important distinction which needs to be drawn. This is the distinction between descriptive and normative theory. Now, while I don't want us to become bogged down in the details of philosophy, if we are to adequately address issues of business ethics and corporate or organizational social responsibility, this is an important distinction to have clearly in mind. Simply put, descriptive theory is concerned with the way things are, while normative theory is concerned with the way things ought to be. Let me give an example and then point out why this is a critical distinction. Physics is a branch of science which is based on the view that there exists an orderly universe with natural laws which are there to be discovered. These laws exist outside of us and operate independently of our believing in them. So gravity is taken to be a law of physics, which would exert its influence on us even if we could suspend our belief in gravity. Normative theories are of a much different kind. Rather than telling us the way things are, as with descriptive theory, normative theories tell us the way things ought to be. They therefore make some claim about the superiority of one course of action over another. So, if I take the position that it is wrong to lie, I am making a normative claim. And such normative claims are not subject to empirical defense in the way that descriptive claims are. The importance of this distinction will become apparent in a moment. At this point, I would like to offer a simple statement from David Hume. One cannot derive an ought from an is. Put another way, one cannot derive normative theory from descriptive theory. Or, put even more directly, one cannot conclude that because things are a certain way, that is how they ought to be. This may seem obvious. However, one of the problems with discussing ethics is that there is not general agreement, especially across cultures, about just what is ethical behavior. Debates about descriptive theory or science can largely be resolved through application of the scientific method through testing of hypotheses. There is no similar universally accepted standard for resolving issues of normative theory or ethics. Is bribery morally acceptable? There is no easy answer to such a question. If this were a question of science, such as the question of whether or not bribery occurs, or what policies and or sanctions are effective in reducing the incidence of bribery, we could rely on the scientific method to provide an answer. Not so with issues of ethics. So how are we to know if bribery is morally acceptable. The first issue which has to be resolved is whether or not moral laws are like natural laws. In order to answer this, we need to look at the character of natural laws. These are laws which exist independently of not only our belief in these laws, but which also exist independently of time or place. Gravity exerts its influence on people in Brazil as well as on people in the United States. And as far as we know, gravity has always existed and will always exist. A shorthand way of noting these features of natural law is to say that such laws are universal. Perhaps the most fundamental question of ethics is whether or not there exist moral principles which are similarly universal. You might quickly respond, yes, but if I ask you to tell me which moral rules are universal, and more importantly, how you know this, it becomes quickly apparent that the issue is more complex than it might first seem. The problem is one of epistemology. There is no generally agreed upon standard for settling issues of ethics, as there is in the sciences. You might respond that of course there are universal moral rules, and that these are grounded in religious tradition. For you, these moral rules are therefore a matter of faith. But what of the millions, or perhaps billions, of people on the planet who do not share your religious tradition? You might claim they too are bound by the universal moral rules of your faith, but this is fundamentally different than claiming that they are bound by the law of gravity. Unlike with gravity, the claim for the universality of moral rules ultimately collapses into a matter of faith. My claim that I am not bound by your supposedly universal moral rules may not be enough to convince you that these moral principles lack universal application. But my claim that I am not bound by your supposedly universal moral rules is enough to change my behavior. The view opposite that of universalism is the perspective of moral relativism. Those who maintain this moral outlook claim that there are no moral rules whatsoever. Rather, individuals are left to determine for themselves what constitutes right from wrong, good from bad, fair from unfair. A logical outgrowth of this view is that what is right for you is what is right for you, and what is right for me is what is right for me. Furthermore, at its extreme, it is claimed that because notions of ethics are ultimately personal, I have no right to comment on the ethicalness of your behavior, and you have no right to comment on the ethicalness of my behavior. One might call this moral anarchy. It is difficult for me to imagine living in a society in which there is no consensus whatsoever about what constitutes acceptable behavior. There is a middle ground between universalism and relativism. This middle ground is known as cultural relativism. Those who believe in cultural relativism attempt to avoid the pitfalls of both universalism and relativism by arguing that each society can decide for itself whether particular courses of action are morally permissible. Unlike the universalists, who might want to claim that bribery is simply wrong for everyone, or the relativists, who might want to claim that each person can decide for themselves whether bribery is right or wrong, cultural relativists would leave this determination to the members of any given society. On this view, one might conclude that bribery is wrong in the United States because societal norms have been so established, while bribery is acceptable in Indonesia Because different societal norms have been so established. Complications enter when the United States establishes policies such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which seeks to make universal, at least for American business persons, a standard which, according to cultural relativists, is society-specific. In his book on moral philosophy, James Rachels points out the shortcomings of cultural relativism. These shortcomings parallel the problem with any form of relativism. Perhaps the greatest problem is that most of us could probably agree that certain actions are simply wrong, although we may not be able to clearly articulate just why. Take the extreme example of a society which decides that it is morally acceptable to eat their young. Now, neither people in Chile nor people in the United States have come to this conclusion. But suppose this one country not only believes in the practice of eating their young, but furthermore routinely engages in the eating of their young. If we truly subscribe to the view of cultural relativism, we have to conclude that not only should we not intervene to protect the rights of the children in this society, but that we don't even have the right to comment on the practice under consideration. What is right in any given society, after all, is what that society determines for its own citizens. Yet most of us would be uncomfortable merely standing by without comment as another society engages in practices which we find to be morally reprehensible. The conclusion I come to is that the perspectives of universalism, relativism, and cultural relativism are each both correct and incorrect, all at the same time. There probably are some universal standards for human behavior, as the universalists want to argue. There probably are some areas of human behavior which are so personal that they involve no possibility of infringing on the rights of others, as relativists want to argue. And there probably are aspects of human behavior which each society is free to prescribe for itself. The trick, of course, is to determine which is which. What are the universal rules? What behaviors are within the domain of personal autonomy? What standards are to be left to the discretion of individual societies? This determination is obviously critical to issues of international business ethics. In thinking through such dilemmas regarding the nature of moral truth, business executives would do well to invoke social contract theory. According to James Rachels, and building on the work of both Locke and Rousseau, the social contract is defined as the set of rules governing how people are to treat one another that rational people will agree to accept for their mutual benefit on the condition that others follow those rules as well. Let me give you an example. I might well agree to a rule that people not lie if others would agree to this rule as well, because this rule would operate for the mutual benefit of those operating under the social contract. I can make this commitment irrespective of any debate over whether the prohibition against lying is a universal duty or over whether individual persons ought to have the right to lie if they so choose. In other words, under social contract theory, my commitment to this principle has done much to emancipate me from the debate over the nature of moral truth. That is, the universalism-relativism quagmire. All I need to know is that it is in the best interests of both the community under consideration as well as in my personal best interest for this particular rule to be followed. The beauty of social contract theory is its ease of application, as well as its ability to resolve issues of organizational social responsibility, as well as business ethics. Up to this point, I have only been concerned with the actions of human persons. Ethics, it will be remembered, is principally concerned with the way in which persons ought to treat one another. Social contract theory, on the other hand, can easily accommodate rules which have only an indirect impact on human activity. For example, both organizations as well as the natural environment can be parties to the social contract. What this means is that we can speak of the duties of persons to the natural environment, or the duty of organizations to ordinary citizens, without ever becoming embroiled with a debate over whether, for example, animals have moral rights, or our organizations or corporations have moral duties. It might merely be in the best interests of society at large if we were to act as if animals had rights and organizations had duties. The justification for thinking in these terms would simply be that a better society was brought about by thinking of non-human entities in these terms. So, it might be agreed that in the United States, bribery is unacceptable, in that rational people might agree to this rule for their mutual benefit. In Indonesia, a country largely lacking the institutional structures for meeting the subsistence needs of even government employees, it might be determined by rational people that bribes, or at least grease payments, are an acceptable mechanism for providing a livable wage for lower-level governmental bureaucrats. As you like it. Two public debates will prove the value of thinking in terms of social contract theory. The first has to do with the issue of corporate downsizing in the United States. It is often the case that employees and managers have different understandings of the employment dimension of the social contract. Managers often take the view that employees have been fully compensated for the time that they have given to corporations, and therefore the corporation owes employees nothing other than reasonable notice when the worker ranks are to be thinned. Employees, on the other hand, may believe that stable relationships over time give rise to duties of either continued employment, some form of parting compensation, or assistance in retraining and relocation once long-term employees are separated from the firm. In short, managers and employees may have very different understandings as to what the social contract between employer and employee actually is. What I advocate is having the terms of such intra-organizational social contracts be as explicit and formalized as possible. Ambiguity regarding employment expectations has led to a multitude of problems in the United States, including a staggeringly high rate of violence in the workplace, directed largely at managers by disgruntled employees. A second issue on which social contract theory might offer some insight has to do with the privatization movement within many Central American, South American, and Asian countries. It is clear that the line between public goods and private goods is dynamic rather than static. It is not clear on what basis this line ought to be drawn. The fundamental problem